The Winnipeg Jets are starting to roll back into town, and some early preliminary informal skates are underway. It's time to get hyped for the upcoming Winnipeg Jets season.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we've got a couple of things to chat about. The Jets are starting to roll back into town for some early preliminary skates. It is almost time for Winnipeg Jets hockey to resume. We already know this weekend we've got the upcoming prospect showdown in Montreal. And then really in just about a week and a half or so, maybe more like 2 weeks, we have got preseason really right at the end of the month. It's really right around the corner. I'm already thinking ahead, maybe a little too far, saying it's only 2 weeks away, but it's pretty close, right? I mean, you really think about it, and we're just about a month out now, a little under a month from the start of the NHL regular season. And Winnipeg is trying to get its ducks in a row, figure out what's going to happen this season. And of course, I want to talk a little bit about this group of players that showed up today and sort of some early thoughts on what we could see out of this team this year, as well as, maybe some prospect stocks that are either rising or falling, and, some of the young players to keep an eye out for this season, especially in Winnipeg's system. It'll be a very interesting year, I think, in a lot of ways. There could be some opportunity for movement between the Moose and the Jets. We will just have to wait and see how things all pan out. But let's start off with today's informal skates. Pretty decently sized group that came in today. You had Scheifele, Toews, Nemesnikov, Miller, Heinola, Pionk, Clegg, Gus, Velarde, Dewar, Fagemo, Sandberg, Perfetti, and Comrie from a lot of the veterans. And then on the youth side, you had Jaeger, Salamanson, Wagner, and Julian. Obviously, these are, not anything to really read too much into, but it is kind of cool to see some of the guys obviously looking forward to coming back and getting, some of that early action. And this is the first officially big Jets stuff that we've seen in some time. So obviously, I think a lot of attention is going to be on Toews. How does he look in camp? What is he looking like as we get into preseason? What is his game fitness level? That'll be probably one of the biggest questions heading into preseason. I would say Toews is a bit of a 50-50 question mark heading into the start of the year. I know a lot of us have sort of thought of him, and really the Jets have sort of thought of him as the 2C, but if he's not physically ready to go, Nemesnikov's going to be the guy that I think would get that call. They already trust Vlad. My thoughts on Nemesnikov. Is he like the 2C for a top-end contender? Probably not. But he's shown that he'll do the job, and he'll do it to the point where Winnipeg at least has somebody who's defensively responsible and can kind of handle the forechecking and eat up minutes. You're not going to get a ton of offense there, but I think in this case, if you're just looking for a stopgap solution, Nemesnikov can be trusted with that duty, and Toews can get reduced minutes that might be more fitting for where he's at to start the season. So he was practicing a little bit earlier with Perfetti and Nemesnikov. Obviously, Toews is going to take some time to warm up. I think we can't really expect him to be at 100% until a little bit of a ways into the season. And even then, we just don't even know what that looks like. And I think that leaves quite a few question marks for this Jets top nine. Somebody on Twitter was asking me, if speed and age are such a big part of what makes these Stanley Cup teams, why are the Panthers the way that they are? And, I understand why people ask that in response to maybe me talking about this Jets team and sort of the age and speed being potentially an issue heading into this year. And I think a lot of people sort of overlook the importance of having elite skill and high IQ. And I think guys like Toews will have some of that, certainly elite IQ and elite skill, but there's only so much that you can compensate for when your body starts to slow down. And I think that's going to be, a bigger question for guys like Nyquist and Pearson, too. They're over 30 at this point. Like a lot of the Jets, they're getting into their senior years. And how much longer can they play at a high level? I think it's a legitimate question. We've already seen Pearson and Nyquist, start slowing down on their respective teams. Gus, many years ago, was a bit of a favorite of mine. I used to love his Detroit Red Wings days, and I still think he had some underrated chops for a couple of his teams following that. But, the last several years, you've definitely started to notice that he's becoming more of a poacher, right? Less of a guy who's driving transition and two-way play, more of somebody who's an opportunistic finisher. And I think that's helpful for a team like the Jets. We could certainly use more finishing talent, but with all of the departures that I think the Jets have had, this team's just going to play differently. And I don't know how that's going to work with Arneal's system, which tends to be, in some ways, very defensive, right? It's kind of like a modified version of what the Bones philosophy used to be. So we'll have to be patient here. I think this team during the regular season will be mostly fine, right? But how this all sort of pans out in the playoffs, well, you probably understand my thoughts on this. Right now, I'm not super optimistic, but we'll see how it goes. Maybe, there could be some surprises in store this season. Maybe Toews has a bit of a renaissance here. Really hard to say coming into this year. There's just a lot of unknowns. And I think that's really, both a little bit nervy if you're hoping the team goes deep in the postseason, and also kind of interesting for those of us who might be looking at this season as one where there could be the opportunity for some transition. Now, I go one of two ways here. In my head, I kind of know that it's not going to happen, the transition season, just because the Jets want to win a cup. But the heart also says that they may be forced to do it anyways because, this team might not have the strongest of seasons compared to what we've seen the last couple of years. But cool to see the guys coming back in. Seeing Heinola there is, it is really nice to have him show up to camp and be, an active participant. Not that he's, somebody that I expect to really play a lot this year, but when you think about how much he's had over the last couple of seasons, less than 60 games total of NHL duty, mostly with the Moose, that's hard for a guy who's now 24 to sit through that and still feel dedicated to the team. But, we signed a 2-year deal a season or so ago. He's ready to show up for work. And I hope that he has a good enough camp that he starts to earn more trust from the coaching staff. I know that people see him as sort of an undersized player and somebody who can't do this. But, it's just a consummate pro thing to be, consistently engaged, to show up ready for work. And I think that that's a very admirable trait. I'd say the same for Stanley, too. Obviously he wasn't part of this group, but I'm sure if he was around, he might still be on vacation or something. It's just a good habit to get into, and nice to see players like Jaeger, Salamanson, Wagner, and Julian also doing the same thing. A lot of the new arrivals seem like they're already ready to get to work. Clegg, Dewar, and Fajimo, who will be really critical pieces of the Moose this year. Maybe even we see one of them somehow get a call-up later. That's going to be a big part of this Jets team. Again, more in an emergency situation, but you always want to leave all doors open. So it's good to have the Jets back, right? Winnipeg has a lot of unfinished business from this past season, more so in the playoffs than anything. They've already reached the summit of what you can do in the regular season. It's now time to figure out how to get to that next level and really hit the elite tier of competitiveness. And part of that is probably starting to think more about the future of the Jets than the present. And I want to talk about some big prospect stocks that are maybe trending up and perhaps on the way down. We'll talk about which players have really risen in Winnipeg's system and which ones are really fighting for their place to impress. Just coming up in a moment. But before we do, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. The NFL season is finally here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with the can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. If you were impressed with this past weekend of NFL action, well, this is the best time to get in on all of the excitement, all of the hype. We had some crazy football. Unfortunately, as a Ravens fan, it was like a dagger to the heart watching them lose to the Bills in embarrassing fashion. But you know what? For all you neutrals, probably a great time. I know a lot of you are Vikes fans. You had a little bit of a little bit of a heart attack, a little bit of a thriller against the Bears. Maybe you think JJ McCarthy might finally be the real deal after a tough start. Well, if you want to make your bet now, this is a great opportunity to do so. You could win big if your first $5 bet wins. So, ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting fanduel.com to get started. That's fanduel.com to place your first $5 bet. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting a little bit about rising and perhaps falling Jets prospect stocks. I want to talk about who's really shot up the rankings here for me and which players have maybe slid a little further down as they fight to keep their spot on, Winnipeg's future core. Starting from the top, like this isn't really going to be super shocking, but last year I probably had Elias Salamonson as the Jets' #1 prospect. This year he's actually been replaced. He has slid to #2, and that's because Braden Yeager, in my mind, has become Winnipeg's #1 prospect. Now I don't want to overhype Yeager, and I want to let him sort of do the talking with action. But Yeager has the sort of talent that I think is really going to translate well to a full-time NHL job. In terms of his ceiling, I do, have maybe a question or two as to just how high Yeager can soar. I've seen a lot of people talk about him as a clear, top 6 center, a guy who's going to be a great fit for the Jets behind Scheifele. And I want to say yes. I will say pump the brakes a little bit. I think Yeager has a really high floor, and I think that's why, for me, he's really high in Winnipeg's system. I will say I think you want to see him explode a little more offensively at the pro level, especially this first season coming into Manitoba's roster, just because, the last couple of years with Moose Jaw and Lethbridge were generally pretty good. But I think, compared to what you tend to see with players of his age range, he didn't quite have the crazy statistical output, right? And this isn't really something where I'm sitting here and saying that it's going to absolutely influence, the career trajectory of a player, right? A lot of kids maybe have a little bit of a slower start in junior and then quickly ramp up and become really important players at the NHL level. But, Yeager's numbers, they're good, right? They're pretty darn good. They may not fly off the page. The reason I've pushed him so far up, though, when he came to camp last year, first off, he looks really close to the NHL. And I think even if he doesn't have the craziest impact on the score sheet, I think Braden's going to be a really strong two-way center. In a lot of ways, his defensive maturity and transition game immediately stood out. These are things that are kind of higher IQ sorts of things. Some of it's, maybe not the most technical part of the game, but it's a really important commitment to defensive work, backtracking, man marking, zonal awareness, all the sort of stuff that I think Yeager already exhibits at a young age. And it's making him to be a very projectable NHLer. For that reason, I think he's probably our #1 prospect right now. I think it's very close, though. I think he has some interesting room for growth. And if he has a really strong start to his Moose campaign, don't be shocked if the Jets maybe give him a game or two this season. I've talked about him being predicted for me to have his first NHL debut this season. I don't know when it'll happen. My guess is if it does occur, it'll be at the second half of the season. But his stocks have the potential to really jump even higher than they already are. Behind him is Elias Salamonson. And you know me, I love Salamonson. I'm a huge fan. He is, for me, one of my favorite prospects in the system. I still think he's probably really close to being the #1 prospect. At times, you could even argue he's probably neck and neck with Yeager. His stocks are still very up for me. Obviously, an injury last year sort of limited some of his game time at the end of the season, but I don't think it's enough to really knock his stocks back. So I'm high on him. I think he's got really good potential to really dominate this year. And it won't be long before the Jets start calling his name. I think it's probably a year or two out, But as DeMello starts to age and Pionk gets older, I think Salamonson is very clearly projected to be in Winnipeg's top four, if not their top pairing. They think the world of him. I think the way that they've treated him shows that, and I would expect his performance to just absolutely justify why they have so much faith in him. He adapted really quickly to North American hockey, had a crazy first season, and on a really bad Moose team was one of their top scorers. So extremely excited about him as he develops the defensive acumen and two-way play. I think that's just going to make him a can't-miss prospect. Another guy whose stock is super up, Kieran Walton. Walton has very much risen to the top of the Jets pool very quickly after an extremely explosive second season. And what's interesting is I've heard part of it was sort of a renewed commitment to his work ethic. Apparently, he wasn't training as seriously before, and then heading into the draft this past year and beyond, there was some question about what his future looked like. And I think somebody kind of whispered in his ear to really start taking it seriously, and that, an NHL team would certainly come calling. And ever since then, he's been a totally different player. One of the most explosive players in the OHL, very clearly one of the top talents on Sudbury. And he has risen all the way to number 3 on my list of Jets prospects. I think he is somebody that I'm super high on. I think the world of him. He's still raw. So let's be realistic about how long it'll take for him. The skating will take some time to sort of work up to NHL level. But I think, with him being so young, it's not something I worry about. He's got some positional versatility. He's a towering mammoth. Says he models his game after Tage Thompson. And you know what? You watch him and I believe him. So super excited. Think he's got some real opportunities, and super excited to see him one day in a Jets uniform. I think he very much projects to be some sort of an NHLer. If you want to start talking about maybe some sliding prospect stocks, Brad Lambert, I think last year really had a strange season. 7 goals and, not a ton of points overall. But then you look at the Moose production in general, and Lambert was still like top 3 on the team. So, I don't think what happened last season is necessarily a pure indictment of his own skill. He's always had some cosmetic issues, and I think that's been clear the last couple of seasons. But I think with Lambert, if you surround him with the right talent, he's an excellent complementary player and somebody who could become, maybe an internal replacement for Ehlers. He's the closest in terms of pure skating ability that the Jets have. And I think his offensive potential is certainly there, right? He showed flashes of it with the Jets last year. I think we'll see more of that on a much deeper Moose team this season. He already had a really good first full Moose year, so I'm not super worried about him. But, compared to some of the other prospects who have only done nothing but improve the past couple of seasons, I think Lambert has slid a little bit in the last year or so. Again, I think there were some factors beyond his control, and the Moose being awful really didn't help him. Maybe he was also dealing with injury because his shooting percentage was low enough to where you wonder a little bit if maybe an undisclosed upper body injury was holding him back. So, that could be something to watch if it flares up again, but we'll have to wait and see. Another guy who's kind of slid a bit just because I think, he maybe didn't have the craziest last season in junior, Colby Barlow. Barlow had a really rough start to his junior season last year. The last year he was going to play in juniors, and we already kind of know what he is, at least in the junior ranks. He's kind of a man among boys, and I think that was always going to be the case. He's physically mature. He's got a huge frame, a monster shot, and his game has kind of become, in some ways, a little bit more shot first and a little bit simple, right? And I think that was one of the questions as to whether or not the skating and maybe the IQ would start to match up to become pro level. And I really don't know. He's a little bit of a black box for me right now. I think there's a way that he can become an effective NHLer. I think the Moose will really need to figure out what his development track is because he's got a lot of good tools. But getting it up to NHL speed and making him a capable middle 6 scorer, that might be the real focus for this upcoming season. If he can start to really push and acclimate quickly, his ability to rise up in the rankings and really drive his stock up, I think could return. But in terms of a guy that, I was kind of hoping for more from in the past year or so. It has been a little bit disappointing to see some of the performances, but he really rallied in the second half of the season, turned it on during the playoffs. The decision making seemed to come back. He went back to doing what he does best, which is just scoring goals and points. So hopefully that continues. He's got a ton of leadership quality, and I think whether he has a crazy NHL, career or not, in terms of the locker room and leadership, he absolutely has all of the personality traits to be not only a locker room favorite but a fan favorite. So rooting for him to have a really big season. This will be a big test for him, but I do hope that he aces it. Last guy that I'll say is a bit of a stock faller is Dmitry Rashevsky. Rashevsky's still pretty good, but the reason I'm sliding him down the system is because he's just not coming overseas. I kind of feel like he's just going to stay in Russia now, and it's a little bit disappointing. I thought Rashevsky could have been a really solid middle six contributor, and in terms of a Jets finisher, I thought he would have been a really nice tertiary option to have. But it seems like he's not really interested in leaving Avangard for now. I think he does have a way that he could technically exit his current contract, but I don't see him doing it. I think he wants to stay in Russia. I think he wants to be closer to home. And, coming to North America, it's really hard, right? I think sometimes people underestimate just how much of a jump it is for a young player to leave home and come to North America, try and fight for a spot. It involves a lot of uncertainty when you already know you have a roster spot in your current native area. So I don't blame him, but I do hope that at some point, maybe he considers changing his mind. If he does, that'd be great. The Jets could use more scoring ability. They could use more offense, and he certainly has a fair bit of talent. But curious to know which of these prospects you really have your eye on. Let me know in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As we are chatting, though, I have a couple of other prospects that I want to talk about as being players to really keep your eye out for this year, right? Obviously, there's a lot of them, but I think there's a couple young prospects in particular that maybe aren't with the Moose this season, but have a lot of intrigue for the future, especially if they can get their development tracks, either accelerated or in some cases on track if they're really just starting out. But we'll chat about that in just a brief moment. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, you're thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we're closing out tonight's episode with a few thoughts on some young prospects to really keep an eye out for. These players aren't with the Jets right now, but have the potential to, in the next couple of years, start filtering into the Moose system and hopefully become, competent pros over the next couple of seasons. One guy that I've got some interesting time for, and I don't really know how I feel about him just yet in terms of his overall potential, but Connor Levis continues to be a tertiary player for me who there's something with this game that I like, and I think it was when he was in camp and in some of those development scrimmages, the passing and vision for me really stood out. And like the numbers with Vancouver last season with the Giants didn't really jump off the page. Now Levis is in college and he's going to be there probably for a couple of seasons. I'd expect him to want to finish out his degree with Bowling Green, so maybe he doesn't come to the pros for a couple seasons. But I always thought that with Levis, the offensive production didn't explode, right? It didn't leap off the page, but there was skill there to where I was still interested. And, obviously he kind of came through the COVID era of junior hockey. And so I want to kind of put that flag in there because I think COVID really screwed up a lot of things for a lot of these kids. And I don't think that Levis was necessarily an exception to this rule. But, I hope to see him have a really good year with Bowling Green. If he comes into NCAA hockey and really starts lighting it up, I wonder if the Jets maybe look at him and start thinking about a future contract. So, he's a very interesting prospect. He has tools that I don't think many of our prospects have. He's not small. He's a pretty big kid, and he has great vision, right? 6'1" might not be the tallest, but I don't know. When I watched him, it just seemed like he was a little bit more lanky and taller in person than it sort of felt like in terms of his actual recorded height. So he's a center. He's got some skill. He's defensively responsible. there's a player there that I'm just intrigued in. So keep an eye out for him. He's a long shot, a bit of a shot in the dark, but a guy that I have some real time for. Alphonse Frey, also keep an eye out for him with Timra. Frey obviously is a young prospect, just recently drafted within the last year or two, and he's still a ways away, but he has some really exciting puck moving ability. His two-way game is still a work in progress, but offensively he's super explosive. He's got some real knack for attacking the face-off circles, and I think the way that he drops below the goal line is super fun. He's the kind of guy that could be a really interesting second pairing defender down the road, especially if you're kind of looking for a sort of Morrissey-like kind of player, or maybe Enstrom before his knees started to give out. Frey could be a really fun one. He still has a lot of work to do, but again, he's, a player just to watch for the future. I think he's got a lot of potential, and if he can start to work on that IQ and decision making, I think he could easily project to be a strong North American pro. Another guy that you'll want to keep an eye on is, of course, Sasha Boumedienne. Obviously, just drafted by the Jets, very fun player for Boston, and as a freshman, immediately earning the sort of trust over the course of the season that he did is, in my mind, a really big testament to his improvement game by game. The fact that he was starting to get top 4 minutes by the end of the year and even top pairing minutes is crazy for a young kid, right? It just does not happen, and I think that really speaks volumes about his leadership, about his work ethic, and his commitment to improvement. He should have a really strong season. I think he has the potential to be another Sandberg in Winnipeg's arsenal, and you just can't have enough of those, right? Strong two-way puck mover with defensive chops, some offensive jump, all that stuff to me is very exciting. So great for him, happy for him. The last guy that I would say you want to keep an eye on is Kevin He. He obviously had such a crazy start to the last year with Niagara. Then, the second half of the season, his numbers started looking, human again. Finally, the production kind of became fairly normal for a prospect in his tier. But I think he's got some sort of special sauce, man. He just seems to be, one of those constantly creative players, a guy who just has a relentless engine. He's worn the captaincy already. He's got the leadership. In my chat with him, I thought he was incredibly humble. He's got the exact kind of personality and work ethic that I think is going to make him a super successful pro. There are some questions about like maybe some of the offense translating to the pro level, but I think he's got a great shot. I think he has a no-quit attitude. That he's always got a super humble approach to things. And as he starts to really develop that pro-level strength and speed, I think he could be a real sleeper for the Jets system. I know that we are all aware of how talented he is, but maybe the rest of the league and really other NHL fans aren't yet familiar with him beyond his name being He, right? Obviously, the He is Him sort of jokes kind of came out, but I have a lot of time for Kevin as a guy who could become an absolute horse for this Jets team. I think he's got some really exciting potential, and if he can start to hone that into top 6 skill, watch out, man. He's got everything else that you want out of a young player heading into the first couple of seasons of his junior career. But curious to know if you're watching any other prospects. He is only about a year away from turning pro. This will probably be his last year with Niagara. He's got his ELC ready. So, it's an exciting time, man. I think this future Jets core, Winnipeg is starting to tailor them to be speedy, industrious players. And I think that is going to be something that really benefits and trickles down across the whole lineup. So this Jets future core, man, I like what I see out of how Winnipeg is drafting. And they've gotten some real credit from a lot of important folks in the scouting scene for how they've approached this. But again, let me know which prospects you're kind of honing in on. Who are you watching out for? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, so have a great night. And as always, go Jets, go.